Welcome to boundariesforeffectiveministry.org and to part 4 of our series on licensed marriage versus Christian matrimony. In part 3, we saw that marriage was a civil contract between a man and a woman. Here, in part 4, we'll show how important it is to know the nature and the elements of any contract, whether it's a contract with God, your neighbor, or the state. There's no difference. The state needs your consent to join the marriage contract because no one can interfere in a lawful contract between two people. That's enshrined in the Constitution and is true of every contract since the Garden of Eden. In fact, we're going to use God's contract with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and how the serpent interfered in that contract. The modern-day state, however, gets the couple's consent to become the controlling party in their contract, just as God got the consent of Adam and Eve to govern their relationship, which he did with gusto when they defaulted on their contract with him. Whenever you apply to some entity, you consent to be governed by its policies and procedures, whether you're applying for a job or entry into a university or for some perceived benefit from the state. So, let's look at the skeleton of any contract. The elements of every contract are: it must be lawful subject matter. A contract on someone's life is not lawful because it violates the commandment, you shall not murder. The second element to any contract is that there must be a meeting of minds. Both parties to the contract must want the terms to go into effect. If there is duress involved, then the contract is voidable because there was no meeting of minds. The third element is that all material facts about the matter being contracted for must be disclosed. A material fact is one that makes you want to go forward with the contract. For example, both parties are free to marry, or not go forward with the contract. For example, one of the parties is already married. Material facts are what create a meeting of minds to take the deal or a decision not to take the deal. There's no deception in a valid contract. Thirdly, there must be an exchange of something of value between the parties. One person wants something of value from the other person, and vice versa. And that's what they have a meeting of minds about. That's what they're contracting over. If I want your Harley motorcycle, for example, and you want my money, we have a meeting of minds and a valid contract. But if you did not disclose the material fact that you don't legally own the Harley, then the contract is voidable. No valid contract is based on fraud. All contracts contain terms that govern the actions of the parties. So, in the Garden of Eden, God wants Adam to take care of his creation. That's God's valuable benefit or valuable consideration. Adam and Eve get to enjoy the garden as their home. That's their valuable consideration. But the terms are, you shall not eat from the tree in the middle of the garden, and the penalty is, if you do, you will surely die. Now, an interesting thing happens. The serpent comes along and convinces Eve that God committed fraud in the contract. Because the garden contained the tree of life, the serpent convinced Eve that they would not die if they ate from the tree in the middle of the garden. Eve defaulted on the contract and ate from the forbidden fruit and got Adam to do the same. The serpent had interfered in the obligations of a contract and caused the contract to go into default. The penalty clause kicked in, and Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, which was then guarded so they could not access the tree of life and would surely die. The serpent was punished for interfering in the contract, and the same thing happens today. It is called tortious interference in a contract because it inflicts injury on the parties to that contract. Now it gets even more interesting. The U.S. Constitution says that no state shall pass any law interfering in the obligations of contracts. If it's unlawful to interfere in a contract from the Garden of Eden to the present day, how does the state get its authority to snatch people's children or decide who gets the property associated with a marriage? Is the state, like the serpent, tortiously interfering in your marriage contract when it inflicts these injuries on your conscience? No. So when the state removes your children from your home against your will, or tells you they must attend public schools or they must be vaccinated, you have a right to be upset, but you have very little, if any, remedy to alter such decisions by the state, because it is a maxim of law that he who consents cannot complain of an injury, and an injury is commonly called a tort. The state does not interfere tortiously in a marriage contract when they have become a legal third party to the marriage through your application for a marriage license. Wait a minute. Did you know that the state could remove your children from your care at their discretion? Did you know that state laws trump God's law after you've taken the state as a partner in a plural marriage? For example, in Cologne, Germany in July 2012, a court ruled that circumcision of male children was illegal. This, of course, interfered in the ancient contract between God and Abraham and affected all Jews and Muslims in Germany. And there is no appeal to God for protection against the state. When the people wanted a king, the state, to rule over them, God told Samuel of the evils of the king's law and warned them that when the king became oppressive, God would not hear their pleas for relief. When this takes place, you will complain against the king you have chosen, but on that day the Lord will not hear you, and neither will the state courts, because you have consented to their jurisdiction over your marriage.
But just because you're a mother doesn't mean you get your children.
That's the equivalent of saying, you've made your bed, now lie in it. Even if you are married in a church, the minister is the official state witness who will sign the marriage license on behalf of the state, thereby creating legal documentation that you have indeed contracted with the state to have jurisdiction over your family life. Under God's law, the first commandment requires that you not be enslaved to any earthly government. For enslavement means that you are ruled by arbitrary force to comply with man's law, even when it contradicts God's law. A marriage license application is no mere formality. It changes the boundaries from holy matrimony under God's law to a commercial business partnership under the corporate law of the state. We have seen that all contracts have the same elements, whether they are with God or humans. In the next part, we'll show some examples of what happens in a family court, and we'll give you some ideas of how people have told us they've handled the issue of marriage without a license. So we'll see you there in part 5.